Nations went this morning. Everybody was up. Everybody was a little louder. Everybody was a little bit more awake. It's funny how food is that essential within our lives where we get to share life around the table, where it enables us to have community, where it also, when we're not hungry, we're not thinking about everything else that's going on in our lives. When we have a full belly, we feel a sense of contentment. Now, my family and I decided to identify with what others would feel like so that when we were doing community with one another around the table, that we were doing also community with people all throughout the world that didn't have what we had. So we did the Rice Bowl Challenge. And we were fundamentalist about it. All right? We were strict. We were like toting the line. And then we would realize that the kids would go to school and they wouldn't eat the rice that we packed them. We packed them in thermoses. We packed them so that the kids could eat. We let the little guy off the hook for lunch. But Samantha and Nathan, dedicated, committed to doing this, did it willingly. They did it with a sense of compassion. They did it with a sense of mission. They did it with a sense of empathy. To identify with what others would experience within their lives. Community is essential for us to do life, basically. We can't do life alone. I've talked about that. We can't live in isolation. I've talked about that. We can't do life alone in isolation without others around us being present with us to experience what we experience within our lives. That's why we huddle up on Sunday mornings. That's why there'll be an opportunity for you to huddle up even in smaller groups of people, because doing life together is vital for our existence, not the bigger existence as a church, not just that, but our existence in doing life so that others understand and know and can be compassionate and empathetic about where we are within our lives so that we know that we don't do life alone. But it's, by the way, guys, I'm talking about other people too. I mean, it's great for us to want to do life, not do life alone, and it's good for us to want to take it all in. But it's also important for us to realize that as the church, as people who follow Jesus, that's our calling as well. So, one of my favorite stories in the scriptures is found in Mark chapter 5. And it's found, and I like what goes on. So I'm going to read a little, I'm going to talk a little, I'll read a little, I'll talk a little. And halfway through, I'll wake you up from your sugar low from all the donuts and bagels and coffee that you drank. I'll maybe kick the pew to wake you up to make sure you're there. The little guy, little Corey, will make sure that you're awake and aware, and you'll turn around instead of looking at me, and you'll see his cute little face, and you'll be like, oh, wow. He's so much better looking than Chuck. By the way, when I was a kid, I had a big-headed little body, so I was just as cute as he was, or is. That's how I needed to say it. So Jesus got into the boat again, and went to the other side. Have you ever noticed that no matter where Jesus went, there was always somebody following him? That no matter what was going on in his life, that there was always a crowd around him, right? Have you ever, when you look, there's something going on with this rabbi, Jesus, that was significant, so much so that he had a huge following. And not just the kind of following of those who were the unlovable, those who were the untouchable, those who were the pariahs of the community. But as you can tell in this story, pay attention, even the leaders of the local synagogues who didn't want anything to do with him because he was preaching and teaching about this grace thing that they didn't agree with. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, notice he has a name, and notice that the other person that we're introduced to in this story doesn't. Just a thought. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him, "My little girl is dying. My little girl is dying. Please come and lay your hands on her, heal her so she can live." His reputation preceded him. People kind of knew what was going on with this guy, this rabbi Jesus. And of course, Jesus responds, right? Jesus always responds to the desperate situation that is going on within the lives of everybody else. Jesus cares about the details of your lives. Jesus cares about what's happening inside your head and inside your hearts, no matter what it is. Jesus went to him, and all the people crowding around him followed him. So now imagine for a moment, we're back in Mark 2. Remember Mark 2? Mark 2 I talked about last week. There's a huge crowd of people in the house. Something Jesus was saying and doing did something within their lives. Now he's going from point A to point B to Jairus' house, and there's something happening that people are very curious about. They want to see if this guy is everything that we've heard about, and so they follow him. We'll talk about this more next week, but if that was my little girl, I'd be putting elbows, feet, knees, doing this, getting through the crowd. If it was my little boy that was in this, I'd be doing elbows, knees, probably a couple headbutts just to get through the crowd. But notice the interruption. Verse 25. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal with many doctors, and over the years, she had spent everything she had to pay them. But she had gotten no better. In fact, she'd gotten worse. There's a woman who's bleeding constantly. She has now spent everything she had. Nobody can help her. She's desperate. Now, let me share with you a little bit about religious preference in that day. According to the Old Testament and some of the laws you see in the Old Testament, you see that if you are a woman who continues to bleed after that time of the month, that's all we're going to say. I don't need to go into anything else other than that. If you continue to bleed, you are now considered unclean. And if you're considered unclean, then you're contagious. So anything or anyone that you touch, now you're unclean. I'm not. I washed my hands this morning. I used a little hand sanitizer before I walked in, so I can't be considered unclean. But if you are a woman who has constant bleeding, you are considered unclean. So what that means is now you're separated. You can't go to synagogue. You can't worship. You can't listen to the scriptures being read. You then feel like you don't have a connection with God And because for whatever reason, this is something that God has given me, or at least that's what they believe. So if this was God's will and purpose for my life, why is this happening to me? And now I don't have any idea about why this is happening to me because I can't have conversation with anybody about it. And so I'm doing life alone because I'm considered an outsider or a pariah. That's just a fancy word for being like a nobody. I learn a new word. I like to use it a lot. So that's kind of why I'm using it. You may already know that. You might be smarter than I am, so you probably already knew that. I just wanted to check in with you, okay? It's like when I talk about VCRs. When I talk about VCRs, you're like, kind of what? Pariah. I find it significant that she interrupts the very person who made her feel separated from God and her faith and her religion. Jairus is a local synagogue leader. He is probably having the same questions that she has had for 12 years, and now she interrupts Jesus and him trying to get to his daughter so that Jesus can do his thing with the desperate. And so we are at this place where I hope, and at least I think, or at least I like to believe, that when you read this scripture and the whole scripture of the story, that something gets triggered inside of you. Think about it. It's been a while, I know, for some of us. But if you were to ask Corey and Brandy, or even if you were to ask Stacy and Pedro, or even if you were to ask any of us who have young children, Jackie, and they get the same response. Every time their kid is sick, you feel this particular way, right? You feel like garbage. You want your kid to feel better. You don't want them to feel what you feel, or you don't want them to feel what you know they're feeling, and you want things to change for them. And so part of you says, I wish I could be the one who's sick. I wish I could be the one who's desperate right now instead of my kid, because you feel hopeless and helpless. Now, I think we probably all have experienced that, and I'm sure some of us have experienced that now with kids going off to college, adult children who struggle with their health. I'm sure that we have all experienced that, even if it's a niece or nephew or... So you can imagine what this father may have experienced, but then also this woman, who's unnamed, is experiencing an interruption. Now, my hope this morning with telling that story, or telling this story, is that the other thing that it triggers is a sense of compassion, a sense of empathy. Like, I'm the worst guy you want to interrupt when I'm on a roll, right? You're like, where's Chuck? He's not in his office. Well, Chuck's not in his office because he knows the phone's going to ring and he's going to get interrupted doing his message for Sunday morning. But I have to think that what this does, when we hear this story where Jesus is interrupted, Jairus is interrupted, that when the crowd is interrupted, that it triggers some kind of sense of compassion and empathy. What I find significant about this story, though, is that the woman reaches out to Jesus' robes, right? She touches the fringes of that particular robe. It's not like she's interrupting the flow of the crowd. It's funny, I got in this conversation yesterday with my brother-in-law, Glenn, and we got talking about this, when you go to Disney and you watch a parade, right? You know how it is, right? If you don't sit and state your territory, people are going to push in on you, and they're going to try to steal your spot. I hate that, by the way. When my kids were smaller, it was easier to put them on my shoulders and be done with it. It's not like that anymore. I can't put them on my shoulders anymore. And so you get this crowd of people kind of crushing in on you when you want to simply see the Halloween parade, which is better than the Christmas parade any day and every day down at Disney. And they're pushing in on you, and you realize that the space that you had for your kids is getting smaller and smaller. So I imagine that the crowd of people, this woman saying she's going to do a little elbow, hoping nobody notices her, because if they do notice her, they're going to make sure that everybody else around her knows that she's unclean, and if she touches them, they're going to be unclean. And so she's quietly and like a ninja trying to get in there to simply touch his robe. This is how desperate she is. Because she's been isolated, because she's unclean from everybody around her. Jesus knows. Jesus experiences it. Fully God, fully human, gets it. I understand it. We don't even need to go into the theology of what is going on here. What's significant for me at this point is Jesus realized at once that the healing power had gone out from him. It's freezing up on me. All right, no biggie. Listen. Thanks, bud. So he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" His disciples said to him, "Look at this crowd pressing around you. How can you ask, 'Who touched me?'" The disciples aren't fully aware of the empathy and compassion that Jesus has in these moments. The disciples aren't fully aware of who he really is and why he would ask a question like this. They're not fully aware of the level of empathy, meaning he could feel and experience everybody else's need around him, and they don't fully are aware of the level of compassion that he has and his willingness to walk through a crowded room to meet a need. They don't get it yet. You know what's funny is I think, honestly, that the disciples aren't alone in this thought. I think that we, because of the hurried lives that we choose, that we don't see the need around us. I said to my brother-in-law last night, we're sitting around and we're kind of processing everything of yesterday. We had a 12-hour marathon funeral kind of thing yesterday. My wife's grandmother died. We started at 8:30 by picking up her cousin. We down in Bridgeton area. We moved back up. I dropped them off at the church. I went back and got the family. We met back at the church. We spent a while there. It was a mass, so it was an hour long. We went from there. We went to the cemetery, which was up in Cherry Hill at Lucaswood. So Woodbury Heights to Cherry Hill and a funeral procession is always so much fun, right? So you listen to some good music while you're doing that because you know you're not going to go up 295, right? That would be too easy. We took all the Kings Highway back roads, and it was beautiful, it was awesome, and it was okay. We went from there, we went to the luncheon afterwards. Before that, we went to Starbucks because, well, I needed Starbucks. We went from Starbucks to the Italian restaurant, which had some really good food. I ate rolls like it was my last roll that I would ever eat ever again. We went from there, the kids took the man van home. Man van. They went home. We went to my wife's aunt's house to look through pictures, and there's some cute, adorable little pictures of my wife when she was a little kid. We ended our day. We started our day at 8:30. We ended our day at 8:30, and it was a beautiful day. It was awesome. I could have got caught up in that messiness of the day. My brother-in-law and I were sitting next to each other, and I always like to pull my brother-in-law and Billy in really super close to me. And I bring him in close to me, and I talk to him, and I remind him that even though he's looking for this greater career and purpose within his life, that his purpose is right there in front of him with his kid. With both his kids. With his wife. And then I told him, I said, you know, it's funny, every time someone was healed back in Jesus' day, he sent them home. Our purpose is right there in front of us. And if we don't have those moments where we slow down and stop the hurried life, we're going to miss them. Maybe that was part of the reason why we did the Rice Challenge, right? To make us very aware of what was going on, not just within our home, but all throughout the world. Maybe this interruption in this moment in Jesus' story, where then he stops what he's doing, asks who touched me, and it wasn't so much about making himself known, but making the woman know, and maybe expanding their vision and their eyes for mission to realize that there are people, even those who remain unnamed within their lives, still deserve compassion and empathy. Maybe the reason why he asked for this woman to come forward, because you could see who touched me, but he kept on looking around to see who done it. And then this frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And this is what he says to her. Does this sound like somebody scolding somebody? I mean, look at the word. Look at what he said. His daughter. An affectionate me. See, when I pull my brother-in-law in, I call him Billy. And the reason why I call him Billy is because I want him to know that it's my way of telling him that I love him. I pull in people like him all the time, and I call them by name, or at least try to remember to call them by name, to remind them that we have this relationship. And I really believe that Jesus called her out of the crowd so that he could remind her that just because she was bleeding for 12 years and experienced healing, that should not have ever separated her from God. That no matter what goes on in our lives, that no matter what we may believe, no matter what may be going on inside of our head and inside of our hearts, no matter what we may believe about who God is, no matter what we may believe about what has happened and whether or not this came from God or if it was supposed to happen in a way that we wanted it to happen, that God still has this unbelievable affection and love for us, that he still sees us no matter what path we choose as one of his kids. The apple of his eye. That God cares about the details of your lives. Now, you've heard me say that probably a billion times, so sorry I'm saying it again. but that God, since God not only cares about you, and that God not only cares about us, but that God cares about those who remain unnamed all around us, that we are to respond with grace, compassion, and empathy so that they remember that they have a connection with who God is, a relationship. See, I'll be honest with you. I'm never going to let you know ever that I have an answer to the question of why. Ever. I'll never try to be the guy who has this profound insight on who God is when it comes to that question. Because I'll be honest with you, I don't know. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure why there are kids who go hungry all throughout the world, and even in our country. I'm not even going to act like I understand why children are neglected and abused in our country. I'm not going to try to act like I understand why hurricanes and floods and tornadoes and why we've been getting slammed lately. And I don't believe that this is the end of the world as we know it. And even if it is, we still got to be who we are, right? The church. But I like to think that we are the ones who bring refuge to the suffering. That we are the presence of God that shows up in the lives of others. That if God wanted to do it alone, he would have done it, but then he chooses to do it with us, even though we're broken and limited, and we want our own way, and we want to make it about us, and yet God says, no, you got to do the things right in front of you. That's your purpose. That's my will for your lives. So you got to alleviate suffering in the life of another person because you are me. You are the one who's making the invisible, my invisible self, visible. That's what I said last week. That's why I think the four friends picked their friend up and dug through the roof, and the only thing that I could think of in that moment is who's gonna fix the hole in the roof, right? And yet we're the ones who make an invisible God visible. So this morning, part of what we do in our church is communion. And I want you to know that everybody's welcome to come, by the way. That it doesn't matter if you're from a different denomination or faith tradition. This is a starting point for us. This makes God, who's invisible, visible. And it is just bread, and yes, it's just juice, and it's tasty grapefruit. It's grape juice, and it's not diet grape juice, that it's the full thing. And so it doesn't feel watered down, and this is bread that's a little tasty, and that's good. But it is just bread and juice, but it makes God, who seems invisible, visible. So I'm going to ask our girls who didn't even know this was going to happen this morning. And they dressed up because they just wanted to simply look good. They're going to help me with communion this morning. And they're going to come up and we're going to do this communion thing, and we're going to ask you as a congregation, as Eileen plays, to come forward in whatever way you need to. Listen, if you're on this side, exit out here. You guys can figure it out. So girls, come on up front, grab the bread and the juice, and we're going to do this communion thing together. Congregation, please don't wait for me to get you to come up. Come on up, take communion. Those on this side, you can come around. Those on that side, you can come around. It's all good.